After spending years away from Earth, the Man of Steel returns to win back his great love and the faith of his people, while at the same time thwarting his greatest enemy's plans for domination. Today we're going to recap the story of the movie, Superman Returns, from 2006. In a huge mansion, a lady in her last moments talks to a mysterious man. He makes her sign a will seconds before she passes away and, even against her family's wishes, the faker gets her entire fortune and reveals that he is the criminal, Lex Luthor. Far away, in Smallville, Mrs. Martha Kent is on her farm, when suddenly, a strong tremor begins. Soon afterwards, a light covers the sky and a celestial body falls nearby. She goes to see what has happened and finds a large crystal structure, similar to a spaceship. Inside, Martha finds her son, Clark Kent, better known as Superman. Later, on a cruise at sea, Lex Luthor, his assistant Kitty and their men find a huge crystal structure in the Arctic. This is the Great Fortress of Solitude, Superman's hideout and the place where he learned about his origin and powers. After exploring the place, Lex finds a crystal panel and soon learns how to use it. He activates a mechanism that triggers the recording of Jor-El, Superman's father, and asks for all the information about the hero's history, as well as the crystals that form this fortress. The next morning, Clark wakes up in his old room on the farm. After playing with his dog for a while, he remembers the first time he discovered his powers, when he was still a teenager. Young Clark used his super speed to run and jump through the cornfields. However, while running, he lost his balance in a jump, hit the roof of the barn and almost smashed into the ground. However, at that moment, the young man managed to awaken another of his powers and stopped in midair before falling, the first time he had ever been able to fly. Back in the present, Clark watches the tragedies that have befallen the world during his years away on TV. His mother appears in the room and asks him why he has been away for 5 whole years. He says that he set off in search of his home planet, Krypton, and survivors, but found no trace of them. So Clark returned to Earth, ready to make up for lost time and resume his responsibilities as Superman. A few days later, he returns to Metropolis and once again assumes his disguise as Clark Kent, the shy and bumbling journalist from the newspaper, Daily Planet. There, he reunites with his friend Jimmy Olsen and his boss Perry White, but also discovers that his great love Lois Lane is engaged and has a child. What's more, she's about to receive an award for her story Why the World Doesn't Need Superman, which only hurts Clark more. He wants to talk to Lois, but the journalist is on a plane to cover a story about the launch of a spaceship. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor returns to his mansion and goes down to the basement, where he finds a model of the city of Metropolis. He decides to experiment with the crystals and asks his men to remove a tiny piece from one of them. After throwing the piece into the model's lake, a strange reaction begins and all the lights in the city go out. Not only that, but there's a power failure in the ship and the plane Lois is in, but they soon return to normal. However, for safety reasons, Flight Control orders the pilots to cancel the rocket launch. They follow the orders, but the system doesn't obey their command and the spacecraft continues to climb rapidly. The plane's pilots try to decouple it from the ship, but the system is also faulty. As a result, when the ship's engines are activated, the plane is carried away at high speed, causing panic among the passengers. At that moment, Clark goes with Jimmy to a bar, where they see the news about the problem with the rocket launch. Aware of the risks facing the passengers, including Lois, Clark leaves the bar in a hurry and, without the people on the street noticing, opens his shirt and reveals the S on his Superman costume. At the same time, the ship activates its main engines and enters sonic speed. Inside the plane, Lois tries to help one of the passengers onto one of the seats, but when the ship picks up speed, the reporter is thrown backwards. The craft continues to rise into the atmosphere and the pilots try to uncouple the plane, but it's no use. Suddenly, the control center picks up an unknown flying object on its radar, which is moving at an impressive speed. Meanwhile, Lois tries to hold on inside the plane cabin, but she keeps being pressed against the wall. Just then, she looks out of the window and quickly sees a suit and cape she knows very well passing by. Then Superman appears and manages to climb into the plane. With his heat vision, he breaks the seals and manages to uncouple the plane, while carrying the rocket safely through the atmosphere. Soon afterwards, the plane begins to fall and its rear end is on fire. The pilots try to correct their course, but the aircraft spins uncontrollably through the sky, causing Lois to be thrown from side to side in the cabin. Seeing this, Superman flies down and reaches one of the plane's wings. He uses his strength to make the aircraft balance, which allows Lois to reach one of the seats and put on her seat belt. However, the danger isn't over yet, as the winged Superman is holding breaks off from the plane. As a result, the hero is thrown backwards, but soon recomposes himself and flies once again towards the aircraft, which crashes at high speed. The superhero is about to reach the plane, only for another wing to break off and soar towards Superman. With no time to dodge, he flies towards the wing and, with his strength and speed, manages to get through it. Despite this, time is running out and the plane is getting closer and closer to the ground. Finally, Superman reaches the aircraft and, as he can no longer keep it in flight, he goes to the front of the plane and uses his body to bring it to a halt. They start to fall towards a baseball stadium, just as a match is taking place. The plane is very heavy, but the superhero uses all his strength and manages to stop it in midair, just a few meters before it hits the ground. After landing the plane safely at the stadium, Superman meets Lois again and is greeted by everyone with a round of applause. The hero then says goodbye and leaves, before seeing Lois faint from the shock of this unexpected reunion. Not far away, Lex Luthor sees the result of his experiment. As well as causing the blackout that almost led to eliminations, he confirms his suspicions when the small piece of crystal creates a huge fortress in his model. Hours later, Lois returns to the Daily Planet for a meeting with her boss. He mobilizes the newspaper staff to do all kinds of stories related to Superman's return, but Lois wants to investigate the blackout. In the meantime, Clark tries to talk to her, only to find her son Jason and her husband Richard instead. Because of this, they exchange few words, but Clark decides to go to her house dressed as Superman. When he gets there, he uses his X-ray vision and finds her reunited with her family. Having confirmed that the great love of his life is out of reach, Superman takes to the skies and resumes his work as a superhero, looking for crimes and disasters that he can prevent. With his super hearing, he hears a bank vault being robbed by heavily armed thieves. The police arrive on the scene, but the bandits set up a huge machine gun on the roof and start shooting at the cars. Just then, two security guards arrive on the roof and shoot at the villain, but it's no use as he's wearing a vest. Without hesitating, the villain points his machine gun at the two guards and fires. Only at hypersonic speed, Superman arrives and stands in front of the firing line. The bullets have no effect on the hero, who walks towards the machine gun. When the bullets run out, the bandit pulls out a pistol and shoots Superman in the eye, but to the bandit's misfortune, the bullet is crushed when it hits the target. Minutes later, Lex and his gang enter a mineral exhibition. Now that he knows about Superman's return, he uses Kitty to create a distraction, while he steals one of the exhibits. So he sends his assistant to drive at high speed through the streets and removes the brakes from the car, without her knowing. As a result, Kitty loses control of the car and starts crashing into vehicles and stalls all over Metropolis. The situation worsens and she ends up outside a restaurant, where she is about to hit a couple sitting at a table. Fortunately, the car mysteriously takes off and it is soon revealed that Superman has arrived to save the day. Thanks to this distraction, Lex and his men manage to steal the ore they were looking for, nothing less than kryptonite, Superman's only weakness. The next day, Clark is at the Daily Planet when he is asked by his boss to come to his office. There, Perry tells him to cover the blackout story, while Lois has to create a new story on Superman. Even against her will, Lois decides to obey the order and extends her working hours, along with her husband and Clark. After a while, she goes to get some air and Clark takes the opportunity to dress up as Superman and find her. Despite her surprise, Lois decides to do an interview right there to find out what has happened to Superman in the last 5 years. He reveals that he went in search of his destroyed home planet, but what he really wants to talk about is the article Lois wrote. She replies that with Superman gone, she decided to move on with her life and came to the conclusion that neither she nor the world needed him. In response, the hero takes her flying around the city and says that every day he hears people needing a hero to save them. The two then return to the Daily Planet and Superman apologizes for walking away. In a moment of fragility, the two almost kiss, but Lois pulls back and decides to return to her family. The next morning, Superman goes to the Fortress of Solitude to get advice. However, when he gets there, he discovers that someone has stolen the crystals from the panel and sets out to find out who did it. Meanwhile, Lois is preparing to go to the Pulitzer Prize Award ceremony, but first she decides to continue her investigation into the blackout. After getting information, she goes to the place where it all happened, together with her son, Jason. When she gets there, she finds Lex Luthor's yacht. Unaware that he is there, Lois enters with Jason and looks for more answers. Unfortunately, she soon finds out what she's gotten herself into when she enters one of the rooms and sees Luthor's wig collection. To make matters worse, the yacht leaves port and the villain soon finds her breaking into his ship. He then takes her hostage and takes mother and son to the main saloon. Inside, Lex Luthor explains his great evil plan, to use Superman's crystals to create a patch of land the size of an entire continent. With this, his new crystal kingdom will destroy the countries around the American continent and thousands of lives will be lost. In return, he will sell space in his kingdom to other countries and, finally, use Superman's alien technology to create a great empire. Horrified by this evil plan, Lois tells him that Superman will soon come to stop it. However, the villain shows her his final card, a cylinder made of pure kryptonite. When he shows her the crystal, Luthor notices that Jason is reacting to the mineral. Lex gets closer and understands that, as much as his mother denies it, that boy must be the son of Superman himself. He then orders one of his men not to let the mother and son leave the room and then begins his grand plan. Outside the yacht, Luthor places one of the crystals inside the kryptonite cylinder and then stows it inside a missile. While he's doing all this, Lois asks her son to play the piano in the living room. Luthor's henchman decides to follow him and Lois takes this opportunity to send a distress fax to the Daily Planet. Minutes later, Lex launches the missile into the depths of the sea. The reaction generates a huge wave of energy and the crystal, mixed with kryptonite, begins to expand. Just as before, this reaction causes another blackout, which disables the fax machine momentarily. Lois tries to turn it back on, only for the bandit to realize what she's done and attack her. The reporter tries to defend herself, but the guy is too strong. The whole situation makes Jason nervous, especially when the thug picks up a rock and tries to attack his mother. At the last second, the boy awakens his father's powers and pushes the piano with all his might, leaving the bandit smashed against the wall. Luthor's other men see everything and arrest mother and son in a storeroom. On the other side of Metropolis, Clark and Richard investigate Lois' disappearance, but the blackout has disabled all the electronic devices. Shortly afterwards, the power comes back on and they receive the fax sent by Lois, containing her coordinates. Richard sets off to catch a plane, while Clark gets into an empty elevator and takes off, exchanging his disguise for the Superman costume. The hero flies towards the sea, but with his keen eyesight, he sees that craters are forming in the water and heads towards the city. Torn between rescuing Lois or saving Metropolis, Superman is forced to choose the second option. He then flies to the city, where the destruction has already begun. A huge tremor begins to break the windows of the buildings and knocks down a worker who was standing on a crane. Fortunately, Superman appears to save him before he hits the ground and sets off to help more people. The tremor continues and knocks down a huge iron sign, which is about to fall on cars with passengers. Superman wastes no time, flies over and grabs the sign before it's too late. Unfortunately, one of the taxi drivers was smoking at the time and was so impressed by the hero's strength that he dropped his lit cigar into a manhole. To make matters worse, the tremor causes a gas pipe in the manhole to burst and the flames from the cigarette create a huge explosion. Meanwhile, Superman uses his heat vision to destroy the shrapnel from the windows before it hits the pedestrians. He then sees the explosion in the tunnel lifting the manhole covers and the fire approaching a flammable products factory. To prevent a greater disaster, Superman flies towards the fire and quickly makes his way to the end of the tunnel. Before the flames reach the factory, he uses his super breath to put out the fire once and for all. The superhero has managed to prevent one disaster, but another is about to happen. The earthquakes cause the large globe at the top of the Daily Planet to detach from the building and start falling towards the ground. Hearing this with his super hearing, Superman flies through the surrounding buildings and manages to catch the globe before it falls on Perry. Far away, Lex is informed about what the boy has done to one of his henchmen, so he, Kitty and the others escape from the ship by helicopter, while Lois and Jason remain imprisoned. Minutes later, the boy tries to use his strength again to open the door, but on the other side, Richard appears and frees them. He arrives by plane to rescue the two of them, but just then, the crystals continue to expand in the sea and hit the yacht. The huge crystal breaks the ship in half and the family is trapped in one of the halves, which begins to sink into the sea. The water floods the entire pantry and the three try to climb their way out. However, just as Lois was about to leave, the door slams shut and hits her on the head, leaving her unconscious. Richard holds her and Jason, but there's no way to open the door and the ship continues to sink into the sea. Only a miracle could save them from this situation, and it happened, in the form of Superman. With his uncanny strength, the hero lifts the ship and rescues Richard and his family. After that, he takes them to the plane and guides them in the right direction. With the family rescued, Superman sets off to find the huge chunk of crystal that has submerged from the sea and searches for the person responsible for all this. In front of him appears his archenemy, Lex Luthor. The hero goes up to the villain and orders him to return his crystals, but to his surprise, Lex punches him and throws him away. Superman soon realizes that he is without his powers, as he is standing on an entire continent made up of kryptonite. Because of this, Lex attacks him with punches and kicks, without the hero being able to do anything. Even so, Superman tries to resist, but then Luthor's henchmen attack him. They throw the hero's body around like it's nothing, trample him underfoot, punch and kick him and even try to drown him. At that moment, seeing the man who saved her being beaten cruelly, Kitty despairs and asks Lex to stop. Instead, he pulls a piece of kryptonite out of his pocket and shoves it into Superman's back, leaving part of it stuck in his body. Even though he is weak and seriously injured, the hero tries to resist, but he falls off a cliff into the sea. Superman tries to remove the piece of kryptonite, but can't and begins to drown. Just then, Richard changes the plane's route and, at Lois' request, sets off to help Superman. After much searching, Jason finds him in the middle of the sea. Lois immediately goes to rescue him and takes him into the plane. With everyone on board, Richard takes the plane away from there, but the aircraft can't maintain its altitude because of the storm. To make matters worse, they start to be pulled towards a waterfall. The aircraft begins to fall, but fortunately, Richard manages to take off at the last minute. Afterwards, Lois goes to look after Superman and finds the piece of kryptonite stuck in his body. With a pair of pliers, she manages to remove it and the superhero regains consciousness. However, Lex Luthor's threat continues and Superman has no time to lose. He says goodbye to everyone and then takes to the skies, heading for his great source of energy, the sun. With the sunlight giving him strength, Superman uses his heat vision and flies at top speed towards the bottom of the sea. In doing so, he creates a huge crater next to the Crystal Continent and manages to break through. Minutes later, Lex and his group are celebrating their victory over Superman. However, the whole place starts to shake and the villain fears it's the superhero's doing. He then grabs the remaining crystals and tells everyone to get out of there as soon as possible. As everything starts to fall apart, the group runs towards the helicopter, only for a huge crystal to collapse right on top of them. Lex and Kitty manage to escape, but his henchmen are crushed by it. The two then reach the helicopter and Luthor hands the crystals to Kitty, while trying to take off. In a crisis of conscience, Kitty decides to throw the crystals away to stop the villain from committing any more atrocities. Seeing this, Lex tries to get them back, but it's too late and he needs to take off before everything falls apart. The villain and his assistant manage to survive, but in the distance, they see Superman, trying his best to lift the huge crystal into the sky. However, pieces of kryptonite emerge from the wreckage, but even so, the superhero doesn't give up. After a lot of effort, Superman manages to get the large chunk of Earth into the atmosphere and hurls it into space. Thanks to this, the planet is safe. However, the hero's efforts were too great and, as well as losing consciousness, he begins to fall. In the distance, everyone sees the sacrifice of their hero, who falls into a small nature reserve. Immediately, the police authorities rescue him and take him to the nearest hospital. The doctors try to revive him and remove small pieces of kryptonite that were still in his wound. However, nothing works and not even the doctors manage to stick a needle in the Man of Steel's skin. Then, using a defibrillator at full power, they try to resuscitate Superman, but the machine is overloaded and the hero's heart is still not beating. Nearby, Lois decides to go to the hospital to visit him, along with her husband and son. While Richard is waiting, she and Jason manage to get into the hospital and go to the room where Superman is. Even unconscious, Lois decides to tell him the truth about Jason being his son. Afterwards, she says goodbye and the boy does the same, unaware that he is his real father. Far away, Lex and Kitty ran out of fuel in their helicopter and were forced to land on a remote island. In the end, the villain's grand plan failed and he was trapped on a small piece of land with no chance of escape. Meanwhile, at the hospital, a nurse goes to check on Superman, only to find his bed empty. Minutes later, the hero goes to Lois' house, where she starts a new article, this time called, "Why the World Needs Superman." Unbeknownst to her, Clark goes to Jason's room, where he is fast asleep. The superhero seizes the chance and recites the same message that his father, Jor-El, left him as his last memory. Finally, Superman leaves, but first he says goodbye to Lois, who was taking a breather outside. Relieved to see that he's okay, she asks if they'll meet again and the hero replies that he'll always be around. So, recovered from his injuries and with his strength restored, Superman flies through the skies as a vigilant guardian, who will always be around to protect Metropolis and the planet he calls home. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.